Great Escape. My name is TJ Peterson. My co-host, Mr. Down Below here, is Mr. Michael Scott Clifton. And we have another Michael joining us today, Mr. Michael Wigington. We're going to be talking about fantasy. Before we do so, Mike, how was your weekend?
Well, it was a hot one. Um, I'm sure if you live in Texas, you know what I mean. And but as I mentioned in our last Wednesday's broadcast, I have finished the fourth and last book in my Conquest of the Veil series, and it's now off to the formatter, and from there, hopefully to be published as an ebook and a paperback. So long story, started 2005 on that. Uh, a million word count. That's what I first started off with. I mean, I'm going to write a blog on this. I said there's a long story. When you don't know what you're doing, you get million. And I thought a million words was the average novel. I thought that was great.
If you're Tolkien.
So I had to condense that down just a wee bit to the four books. And so gosh, it's been hard to explain, but it's like this huge weight's off my shoulders. I've finally accomplished something I've worked a long time on.
Good. That's a relief too once you get it going and get it up there.
But other than that, it's been a great week.
How was your week?
Michael?
Did you freeze?
Michael, how was
did
your
you
week?
ask me?
Yeah.
How's my week or weekend?
Both.
Both, Mike.
Oh, well, weekend was good. We had our grandkids up until Sunday of last week, so we had a lot of fun with them, taking them to the movies, and having a lot of fun with them and watching them react to our squirrels we have outside that we feed. They're a lot of fun.
Okay, guys, we're having some technical issues today. Hopefully they won't continue to bleed over, but Mike, can you hear me?
Yes.
Michael? Okay.
Oh.
Making sure. So today we're going to be talking about fantasy. Michael, I think that's who we're going to have to distinguish. You're going to be Michael.
Right,
and then So Michael, how did you start writing fantasy? Why did you start writing fantasy? That sort of.
Yeah, I started reading fantasy, back when I was 7, 8 years old, when I discovered the Chronicles of Narnia, and that really set me off onto that kind of escapist type adventures. And then, of course, found The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. But my mom would also take me to movies like Jason and the Argonauts and Hercules and stuff like that when I was a kid. So that just kind of fueled my love for that kind of thing. And then as I grew up, I just was, an avid reader of fantasy and sword and sorcery and that kind of stuff. And it really, I dabbled a little bit in writing, but it really wasn't until I met my wife when she was reading some of my stuff, and she was like, "Hey, that is playing like a movie in my head. I can see it. You're a writer." And because of her, I started to take it, more seriously, and thought, well, I could give this a shot and write a book. And so she inspired me and coached me and all that kind of stuff. She's really good with that.
So have you written anything outside of fantasy, or has it strictly been fantasy this whole time?
Oh yeah, no. I've read Dean Koontz. I've read Ayn Rand. I've read Louis L'Amour, and historical fiction like Bernard Cornwell's probably my favorite living author right now, and he's got some very successful books and TV shows.
So
not just my reading is all over the place.
When you're actually writing fantasy, what's the difference between writing fantasy and, say, just writing a general fiction? Like what tweaks it to make it fantasy is what my question is. For those watching,
Well,
kind of out. I know
think
but
I think that in order for something to, in my opinion, to be considered fantasy, it has to give the reader a sense of the fantastical, something that's unexplainable to a degree. I think whether it be magic or dragons or and it doesn't. I mean, the urban fantasy, they've kind of proven it doesn't really matter what world, and whereas probably around Tolkien's time and after, a little bit after, it was always a medieval world where fantasy took place. But it really needs to give the reader a sense of the fantastical, and if you don't have it, I don't think that it's fantasy at that point.
So your books in particular, what tweaks it to be the fantastical part in it?
It's the magic. There's monks and mages and people that can use magic, and the world has like some fantastical creatures. They're not overdone, but there's some elements of fantastical creatures and trees that can that kind of stuff. Those kind of, some of them are tropey fantasy elements that I love and wanted in my book.
Mike, you have 3 books published: The Bloodstone Reckoning, The Mist Witch of Dreadark Forest, and The Shadows of Witchering. And correct me if I'm right here. The Bloodstone Reckoning is the first book in a series, and The Mist of Dreadark Forest and Shadows of Witcherings are novellas, correct? But they're based somewhat on the Bloodstone.
That's
Reckoning.
correct.
Okay. I've read the Bloodstone Reckoning,
especially The Shadows of Witchering.
I've read the Bloodstone Reckoning, and it's an excellent book. And so, if anyone watching out there,
thank you.
I think I gave it a 5-star review, and I thought you did a really good job on your main character and describing the situation, and both past, present, and I think future. You gave hints of that as well, of the sequel to your book. But so why don't you talk a little bit about what kind of gave you the idea for your first full-length novel, The Bloodstone Reckoning?
Okay, yeah. So it's probably, I don't know, maybe weird or out there or whatever, but I listened to a genre of music called power metal, and there's a band from Germany called Edguy, and then Edguy had a song called The Realms of Baba Yaga. I'd never heard of a Baba Yaga, didn't know what a Baba Yaga was, and so I looked up this Baba Yaga, and I read she's a Slavic myth, and I was like, that is super cool, and I've never heard any stories of Baba Yaga. There's no mainstream, except for which I really didn't realize at the time, but it's a little anime that's real popular of it right offhand, but it does have Baba Yaga in it. But in all of the myths and anime, the Baba character is generally always evil. She's bad. I mean, and she's, if you meet her, you're going to fall to misfortune. And I thought, well, what if something where she's actually, so the protagonist that encounters her is afraid of her, but what if she's really good? And so that's what I was like, she's not bad. She just has this, kind of persona of the way she looks and the way she kind of keeps herself and all this stuff that's like this, but yet she's really a good, on the side of good and trying to do good things. And that's what spawned that idea, was that song. I could see in my head this movie playing of this terrified young girl who's in this hut with this old woman. And so I wrote that scene and then discussed it with my wife, and we came up with the whole concept of it, brainstormed it, came up with it, and I was just, took off from there.
So question is, are you a planner or are you a pantser in writing?
I'm a little of both, actually. So when I started writing, it kind of goes like this. I start out pantsing, I come up with a scene, and it plays in my head like a movie. So I write it down, and then I will take the main character and I'll put their name on a blank document, and then fill out some history, and then other characters that come in, I fill out all their history, and then you kind of got to get the objective of what the storyline is going to be. What's the story problem here? And then I'll start kind of planning some from there, and then sometimes the scenes will just come to you as you're writing, and it wasn't anything that you planned, and you just keep pushing forward. So I really like to do both. I don't sit down and plot out everything and, okay, here's the beginning, here's the middle, here's the this. No, but I will plan throughout the story as I go along.
That's interesting. That's unique. So you start off with no organized plan, but then as you get into it, uh, bits and pieces that you follow up with are in fact you outline out and fill out as you. So that's the actual. So you are actually planning as you go along.
Right. I
And
plan as I go along, but generally it
yeah,
starts out with the seat of my pants. Like
right.
like I said, with the song "The Realms of Baba Yaga," I had this scene playing out in my head, and I'm like, this scene keeps playing in my head, so I write it down. I'm like, well, that might make a fun book, and then you just keep going from there. And then the story problem is the big kicker, and that's that's where you got to really nail it down, and it does take some planning.
Well, so I was a little fascinated by because, like I said, I read the Bloodstone Reckoning, and it was really good, and you do a good job of creating believable characters that could be in any genre, you know, historical fiction,
Thank you.
thrillers, mysteries. But why the? I guess I'm asking why the novellas? Why not just right into the sequel? What was? Uh,
Yeah.
how did that
So
transpire?
yeah. So the the Shadows of Witchering came about because I wanted a pilot, something I could give away to people, and with all CJ, and I wanted to be able to say, well, here's a sample of my writing, and I didn't want it to be a full length novel because I didn't want to have to give it away, novel, but it was connected to the Bloodstone Reckoning in that the legend of Emmeline the Mage, the story of Shadows of Witchering is one of her younger day adventures, one of her first adventures as a young mage. So I was like, well, I could use that as a pilot, as a giveaway, and then I was for the Mistwitch of Dreadart Forest. I was actually, this is funny, I was creating the realm that the mentor in Bloodstone Reckoning, Baba, the part of the world that she's from, and it's very Nordic, Slavic. Because I wanted to stay true to that Baba Yaga character, and so I was making all these lands, and I was naming all the places, and all the places get to have histories and stuff behind their names, and I wanted to make a nod to one of my favorite video games, which was EverQuest, and they had a forest there called Feydark, which the Fey is like the elves and fairies, or the Fey, But I was like, yeah, but it can't be that necessarily. But I had come up with this god that they worship. He's a dream god, and his name is Dre. And I was like, well, Dre, that's a great name. And so it's his forest. It's dedicated to him, and that's where that story went down. And then all of a sudden, I have the Dreadart Forest, and there's this kind of legend behind it, and so that legend into the story of the Mistwitch of Dreadart Forest.
Can readers, if they have not read the Bloodstone Reckoning, uh, can they pick up a copy or buy a copy of the Mistwitch of Dreadart Forest or Shadows of Witchering and read them as standalones, or would they need to have read the Bloodstone Reckoning first?
Oh no, they're total standalones. Yeah, they don't
Okay.
involve. They're hundreds of years before the Bloodstone Reckoning.
Okay.
Yeah, they're standalones. They involve a main character that has really nothing to do. Well, I'm not in the Shadows of Witchering. That character is a legend in the Bloodstone Reckoning, but you don't have to have read the Bloodstone Reckoning to uh, catch on to Shadows of Witchering.
Okay.
And then the Mist Witch is a legend later, from the mentors, from where she came from. She grew up with that legend, but it's own separate story.
So, so on the
Dealing with
sequel,
I'm trying here.
so you're working on a sequel to the Bloodstone Reckoning, correct?
Yes, yes, the second part. It's titled "The
Okay.
Darkness Rising."
Okay. So if one had read the Bloodstone Reckoning and they're very much awaiting the sequel or novel, what can you tell them about when they can expect it might be published, be out, and that where they can get a copy?
I'm hoping. I'm really trying very hard to get this thing rewritten. Writing a sequel and then rewriting it is a lot harder than I initially thought. It's tough.
I testify to that. Yes.
But I'm hoping to have this rewritten completely and back to my editor by the end of August. I'm hoping to have it probably out to the public. I'm really hoping by the end of October.
Okay. Okay.
If everything works the way I want it to, by the end of October, it should be out.
So, what made you choose fantasy over any other genre when you started writing?
Laziness. I'm kidding, really. Well, I love historical fiction too, not as much as fantasy, but when you look at historical fiction
There's a lot of
and the amount of work that it takes to a lot of research. I mean, Bernard Cornwell talked about the years of research he had to do before he wrote his Arthurian trilogy. And even writing fantasy, I had to do a lot of research because there's things that you incorporate. And if you're in a medieval type world, things that people expect from a medieval type world, you need to understand the rules and things of a medieval, world, or what period. Was it feudal, or was it this, or was it Renaissance, or how did they dress? What words do they say? Things like that. You can't, in my opinion, you shouldn't be using, modern slang in a medieval fantasy book. So there's a lot of, if I use slang words, they will come from like 14th, 15th century or something like that, somewhere way older than now. Words like, privy liquor and stuff like that, just little insults and things that these toss around.
No, cool it, dude, or phrases like that in your book.
That's a big put off for me, actually. If I read a fantasy book and they're all using day slang and stuff, I just put it down. I can't read it.
Yeah. Not very consistent.
But no, really, I chose fantasy because of the fantastical, because you can have a dark forest that's full of mystery. And my favorite tropes is a dark forest and you don't know what's going to happen in there, and or a dark castle, dungeon, or those kind of things, or those are the elements that I love. And so you can make anything happen. And I love that, the expansiveness of it. With historical fiction, or if you wrote a thriller, you're limited to of the rules of today's world. So like if you're, Dean Koontz, and you're I mean, he can write some pretty horrific stuff, and those are pretty out there too. But I mean, a car is still a car, and it's only going to do car things. You know what I mean? There's rules that apply to that world. Fantasy world, I can expand those rules and make things bigger and or I can condense all kinds of, I think it just has more room for a deeper creativity.
Yeah, well, mine is like I have a book coming out at the end of August, beginning of September, and it's a time travel book. So talk about trying to do research on like 1813, 1922, 1987. And then my short story is 1650, same characters, but trying to bounce within those and yet staying and following the rules of law is what I call them, from D&D, but the rules of law within that particular community in that particular time frame. And so it's interesting. It's kind of a little bit painful, but it was a challenge, and I like a challenge.
Well, Mike, I know you're past president
Yeah.
of the East Texas Writers Guild. Can you
Yes, sir.
have there been any authors or mentors that have helped you with your writing that you look up to, or can you recommend why an inspiring author should join a writers organization?
Yeah, as far as people that have mentored me, first off, Kara has helped me a lot, and she's not an author, but she really is so supportive of me and helps me immensely. And then as far as authors go, Caleb Pirtle kind of took me under his wing and encouraged me and gave me good advice and I was time with Caleb and I really he's a great writer. And then I also look up to guys, of course, hitters of the fantasy genre, J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert Howard, and Robert Jordan. Those guys, and C.S. Lewis. Those are the heavy hitters, and they've influenced on my writing. And of course, Bernard Cornwell. He's historical fiction. I would call his Arthurian trilogy historical fantasy. Merlin uses magic, but you don't know if it's magic or a coincidence. So I think that's a lot of fun.
Robert Jordan.
Those are the guys to look up to.
If
Wheel of Time.
If you could give
he wrote Conan books too.
Robert Jordan and Robert.
Do what?
Robert Jordan wrote the fantasy. Wrote both the Wheel of Time and some of the Conan books, correct?
Yeah. And Robert Howard wrote Conan, and he wrote Solomon Kane.
He was the originator of the Conan series. Yeah.
If you had to give advice to somebody who wants to write fantasy, what advice would you give them?
Who wants to write fantasy? Well, you need to read a lot of fantasy. I would read quite a bit of fantasy, and also I think it's kind of sounds silly, but I was a World of Warcraft nerd for 10 years, so and that helps too. And fantasy movies, they'll help give you,
like world building skills, like for example, Dungeons and Dragons, any like role playing games, you have to develop characters, you have to develop the world. And so those actually are really good tools for learning.
I have one more question for you.
Yes, because world building is huge. Yes, sir.
So because we were visiting a little bit before the broadcast, you talked about your word count. So, and we're speaking of Robert Jordan, Wheel of Time books, which are very big books.
Huge stops.
Terry Goodkind, the Sword of Truth series, and all of that. So one of my turnoffs personally about fantasy is books that are dictionary sized. That are, that could be used as doorstops. And when you were talking earlier about what got you started on fantasy, what you said was almost exactly how it happened with me. So I'm used to. I know that fantasy books are, because of world building, are going to be bigger, longer books, bigger books, more word count than than any other genre. But do you think that, I guess what I'm asking is, what is your views on when writing fantasy in terms of word count and the length and size of a book, whether it's a standalone novel or a book in a fantasy series?
Yeah, I think that readers do tend to expect them to go a little longer than a typical book or romance book. So when you pick up a fantasy book, you're expecting something a little bit, longer. Um, but with that, there comes with the pacing, because you really have to keep the pacing
Mm-hmm.
done well. That's one of the things that Robert Jordan was pretty good at, was especially early on, was the pacing of his books, and Good Kind. So that's one thing. But I think the audiences nowadays also, their attention span isn't what it used to be, and so
That's
sitting down with
right.
a book, and that's why I'm trying to trim mine down about 100,000 words, to kind of keep their attention and keep them reading. And then it's the end is near kind of thing, because if people they get bored, or if it lags, or if it's too long or whatever, I think they're going to put it down
Yeah. I
and
think the I think the Robert
maybe
Jordan
not come
books,
back to it.
the Wheel of Time books, I think I read somewhere where the average length was like 350,000 words in the Wheel of Time books, of which
Yeah,
there's
the
13.
Eye of the World, I think was 304,000 words or something like that.
Yeah. Are you back, CJ?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay. Before I get cut off again, there is no book world next week on August 3rd. We'll be returning on August 10th we're going to be talking about branding. What it means
Oh,
to the
good.
author,
Yeah.
the reader, that sort of thing. Michael, thank you so much for coming. Sorry about the technical difficulty. It's very painful for me on my end, because I had to keep rebooting. So thanks, Mike, for covering over. Does anybody have any last minute? We have about 3 minutes left.
Well, before we leave, where, Mike, normally you do the CJ, you've been cutting out, but where would readers go to either find your website or find your books?
All of my books are on Amazon, and my website is down below at fantasyinmyveins.com. And that will take you to my Amazon page too.
Good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
Mike,
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Like I said, sorry about the technical difficulties. Hopefully they'll be sorted soon, but I have a feeling the heat's playing a master part in it. So that's your newest book coming out, How the Sun Scorched the World.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike.
Thank y'all for having me.
That was a great interview.
Thank you. Y'all
have
a good one.
Before we start to lock up again next week. And we will see you guys the week after.
Bye-bye.